All right, welcome everyone to Miss Wright's final read aloud for our story Pax. Boy, our main characters, Pete and Pax, have had quite the adventure on their own, and the struggles they've gone through have been pretty intense. Today we will be finishing the story, and don't they deserve a happy ending? I certainly think they do. And let's see if that's what they get. All right, so I'm glad that you're joining me for our final read aloud today. When we last left off, Peter was traveling in the woods where Pax is, and he found Runt's leg and the toy soldier, and he thought that was Pax, and he was feeling very sad, okay? And we are starting with chapter 31. Pax reached the tree just as the coyote sprang again, this time finding enough purchase to hang from the branch. Pax flew at him and bit a mouthful of bridled fur and hung on. The coyote dropped and sank his teeth into Pax's shoulder, all in one motion. Pax jerked free and then back toward the south edge of the clearing, hoping to lead the coyote away from the tree, away from the den, away from the foxes he loved. The coyote didn't follow. He threw back his head and barked. Then he turned to eye Bristle again. Pax lowered himself and began to creep back toward the tree. But then he stopped. He swung his head toward the sound of the encampment. His boy's voice? Again, the tall coyote barked again, and this time the call was answered. 3 sets of ears cocked at the same spot in the juniper ring. A second coyote trotted out, another male, this one pale and stocky. He surveyed the scene and broke into a gallop for the tree. Bristle issued another threat howl and spiked her fur, but Pax saw her roll her eyes in terror. The second coyote pawed at the trunk. Then Pax heard it again. His boy, calling his name. He bolted out of the clearing and through the stand of trees, and at the ridgeline above the mill, he stopped. War-sick men streamed from the walls, sticks raised, converging on a figure down in the field. It was a black-haired youth, curled on the burned ground. His boy? The wind, blowing from the north, told him nothing. The soldiers stopped, their sticks still menacing. The boy rose. He was tall, but Pax saw his body didn't look like Peter's. This boy's shoulders were thrown wide and braced under a narrow pole. Stranger still, this boy held his head high, not canted downward. He faced the men in defiance, something Pax had never seen Peter do, and raised his fist and shook it at them. A single soldier ran down to the field. This one moved like his boy's father. He shouted, and the voice was familiar. But then the man walked to the boy and embraced him, something Pax had never seen the father do. Were these his humans? Pax tried to scent, but the gusting breeze carried only the musk of the enraged coyotes. He turned back for the clearing. Chapter 32. Peter let his father hug him. For so many years, he had wanted to be in that circle of protective love. He felt his father quake with sobs, and he wanted to reassure him that everything was all right. But it wasn't. His hands stayed clenched, one on the clutch grip, one on the toy soldier. He pulled away. What are you doing here? You told me you would only be laying wire. And then he understood everything at once. Why the men hadn't advanced. How the grasses had been burned and the trees uprooted and the river strangled with rocks. How there could be nothing left of his fox but a single leg. You knew! He shoved the toy soldier into his pocket and picked up the fox leg. "You knew! You did this! Pax!" Chapter 33. Again, Pax thought he heard his boy's voice. He pricked his ears back to the camp. Just then, the wind shifted. Pax smelled the war-sick sweat, their cordite, their motor fuel, their charred fields, and his 2 humans. He ran back to the ridge. He saw his boy lift something from the ground. A stick, but not a stick. Something furred and broken. The grief-yearning scent rolled up the hill, fresh and keen from his boy, but also old and strained, from his boy's father. So this scent was not Peter's alone. It was the scent of humans. His boy held the broken thing above his head and cried something angry. And then, "Pax!" And Pax barked. Chapter 34. Peter held what was left of the fox high above his head and called his name, "Pax!" And above the mill, an answering bark. Hope rose in his throat. But no, he must have just wished for the bark. He scanned the ridgeway. Anyway, a flash of red, a white-tipped brush. A fox appeared in an open spot and rose on his back legs. On 2 back legs? And looked straight at him. Peter pressed the fox leg into his father's hand. "Bury this." Then he grabbed the other crutch and turned for the hill. "Wait, Peter! You have to understand. It's my duty." Peter pointed to the fox on the ridge. He thumped his chest so hard it hurt. "That's mine." His father shouted to him about wires. He shouted at him to stop. Peter saw the wires. He pulled over them. But he did not stop, because there was only his fox, waiting on the spine of the hill and the distance between them. Over and over he planted his crutches and swung through, closing that distance. When he was almost there, his shirt dried from the wind and soaked again with sweat. He stopped and called. Pax tossed his head and then bounded away toward the trees. On 4 legs! Peter was sure of it. Pax was unharmed. Peter followed again. But again, as he neared him, Pax broke away, galloping into the trees. Peter followed again. He didn't begrudge Pax this testing game. He had broken his pet's trust. Why wouldn't he be skittish? Why wouldn't he need to assure himself of Peter's loyalty now? For as long as Pax wanted, Peter would obey. It was a fair punishment. Through the trees, 100 long yards and 100 more. Peter followed. And then they broke into the clearing, and the fox stood and waited. Peter reached him. He offered his hand. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Pax locked Peter's gaze, and then took his wrist in his jaws. Peter's pulse jumped at the bracelet of teeth, pressed just tight enough to claim him. Just tight enough to call Peter's own wildness. 2, but not 2. Pax released Peter's wrist and tore across the clearing toward the crooked tree. Circling the tree was a pair of coyotes. Pax lunged at the taller one. "No, Pax, come back!" The tree was so far away, 50 yards at least. Peter dug his crutches into the turf and piked hard. When he was a dozen yards away, he saw the coyote's treed quarry, another fox, bright-furred with a sharp and delicate face, a vixen. She was bleeding from a gash on her haunch, and instead of a thick brush, she thrashed the blackened whip of her tail. The vixen swiped at one of the coyotes from above, taunting him, and Pax snapped at the other's flank. Peter saw that the 2 foxes were a team, and they were no match for the coyotes. Peter barreled for the tree, shouting, but the coyotes ignored him. The taller of the 2 spun and sank his teeth into Pax's neck. Pax shrieked. and Peter roared in fury. He braced himself on one crutch and leaned back and side-armed the other, heavy with his white ash bat, as hard as he could, aiming in between the two coyotes. Both of them wheeled around the outrage. While the tree rang with the bat's blow, the dark one sprinted away and disappeared into the brush. The other one bolted a dozen yards, and then stopped, and then turned back. He eyed Peter and bared his fangs. Peter bared his teeth back. Pax growled at his side, hackles raised, ready to spring. Peter swept his second crutch over his head and roared again, and Pax snarled at the pale coyote reared back in surprise. He turned and crashed out of the clearing. Peter clutched at the tree. He slid to the ground, shaking. Instantly Pax was on him, wriggling under his neck, licking his face, sniffing his broken foot, nuzzling his face again. Peter wrapped his arms around his fox and pressed his face to the piney-smelling fur. "You're okay! You're okay! You're okay!" The vixen leaped over them to the ground and disappeared in the juniper scrub ringing the clearing. Pax sat up and barked to her from Peter's lap. After a moment, Peter saw a black muzzle point out from the brush. Out came a skinny fox, about the size Pax had been at 8 months, blinking in the sunlight. He stumbled into the clearing on 3 legs. The vixen re-emerged. She paced and yipped at the runty little fox, shooting wary looks at Peter. Pax squirmed out of Peter's arms and barked again. The 3-legged fox took a few steps closer. Its limp was so awkward, Peter realized he must have lost the leg only recently. Then he made the connection. He offered his hand and called softly. Hesitatingly, his gaze darting between Peter and Pax, the little fox hobbled over. He tucked his head under Pax's chin. Peter extended a finger. The injured fox allowed him to brush his neck for an instant and then hurried back to the safety of the vixen's side. Together, the 2 foxes looked expectantly at Pax, and then they melted into the underbrush. And Peter understood. His fox belonged to them, and they belonged to Pax. Inseparable. All this way he'd come. All this way. Peter got to his knees. He placed his hand on Pax's back and felt the muscles jump. Peter looked around. The woods looked dangerous now, full of coyotes and bears and soon humans at war. He looked down at his fox, still straining to follow his new family. Go. It's okay. It wasn't, though. The pain scored him hollow, left him without breath, like a kick to the heart. He pulled his hand away, because Pax would feel that a pain that deep and he wouldn't leave. Go! Pax shot away toward the brush line. Then he turned back to look at his boy. Peter felt tears roll down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. Pax sprang back. He whimpered, licking at the tears. Peter pushed him down. He found the crutch and levered himself upright. No, I don't want you to stay. I'll always leave the porch door open, but you have to go. Pax looked toward the brush and then back at his boy's face. Peter dug into his pocket and pulled out the toy. He lifted it. Pax raised his head, his eyes trained on Peter's hand. and Peter hurled the plastic soldier over the brush and into the woods as far as he could. Sometimes the apple rose very far from the tree. And that's the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it and you enjoyed our read alouds. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.